I want you to picture right now the absolute most powerful person or company or even country that you can conjure up in your mind.
Yeah, get a really clear image of them in action.
Exactly. And chances are, you're picturing a billionaire aggressively executing some hostile takeover or a political leader shouting demands from a podium.
Or a global superpower parading like intercontinental ballistic missiles down a capital city street.
Right, because we are conditioned from birth to associate influence with force. I mean, we just assume it requires relentless noise, vast wealth, and, well, unadulterated aggression.
We do. But what if that baseline assumption, the very foundation of how humanity has understood influence for centuries, what if that is completely structurally backwards?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because that question, it forces a total reevaluation of history and behavior.
It really does. We're so accustomed to viewing power as a tangible object, right? Something you grip tightly and wield against your opponents.
Yeah, like a weapon.
Exactly. But a closer examination of enduring systems, whether we're looking at geopolitical empires or, honestly, fundamental physics, it reveals this huge paradox.
Which is that the entities gripping the tightest, the ones exerting the most force, are almost always the most fragile.
Right. And that is the paradigm shift we are unpacking in today's deep dive.
Yes, we are exploring two profoundly dense and revolutionary texts by the systems theorist Sandeep Chavan, The Philosophy of Power and the Unified Power Architecture, which is often referred to as just UPA.
And it's important to note right off the bat, reading these sources, it doesn't feel like reading a traditional political science treatise or like a corporate leadership manual.
Not at all. It reads way more like a physics textbook mapping the thermodynamics of human behavior.
Yeah, and global architecture. Because Chavan completely bypasses the traditional moral or tactical discussions of leadership.
He strips all that away.
He does. He builds a structural framework from the ground up, stripping away the ego and the ideology to look purely at the mechanics of influence.
So our mission today is to essentially upgrade your mental operating system. By understanding his 12 laws of power, we can deconstruct why traditional models of dominance are collapsing and how the new global landscape, what he calls the compute century, actually operates.
Which is a huge promise, but the source material really backs it up.
It does. So let's start with the foundational premise that underpins everything Chavan argues. He calls it the grand illusion.
The grand illusion, right,
Yeah.
which is the belief that power is a possession.
Which it isn't, according to the text. He says power is never owned, it is a consequence.
Yeah, and that concept, power as a possession, is the central flaw in human strategic thinking, according to Chavan.
How so?
Well, he argues that influence does not originate within an individual, a corporation, or a government. It resolves temporarily through a state of alignment.
Okay, alignment.
Right, it's a condition of the environment you're operating in. He uses the mechanics of potential energy to illustrate this, which I thought was brilliant.
And the boulder analogy.
Exactly. Potential energy doesn't live inside a boulder resting at the top of a hill.
Right, you can't cut the boulder open and find the energy.
No, the energy exists as a consequence of the relationship between the mass of the boulder, the angle of the slope, and the gravitational pull of the Earth.
So if the hill flattens out,
The potential energy doesn't fight back or resist, it just vanishes. Because the geometry of the field no longer supports it.
wow. Okay, so power is the natural mathematical consequence of everything in a system being perfectly aligned.
Exactly.
But he takes this a step further, and this feels incredibly counterintuitive to how we are taught to lead. He argues that the absolute moment power is claimed, touched, or defended, it instantly begins to decay.
It does, because treating influence as a possession introduces ego, emotion, and most destructively, reaction.
Reaction is the killer.
Right. The moment an entity reacts to a threat to, like, quote unquote, protect its power, it has shifted its operational mode from structural alignment to active enforcement.
And that shift is the catalyst for systemic collapse, which usually happens way before any external adversary actually attacks.
Yes.
I want to pit this directly against the classical theories of power that have essentially built our modern world. Because Chavan calls out the most famous political theorists in history here.
He really goes after the heavy hitters.
Yeah, you have Machiavelli, right, arguing that it is safer for a ruler to be feared than loved. positing fear as the ultimate mechanism of control.
And you also have Thomas Hobbes, who was writing in the aftermath of the English Civil War, concluding that human nature is fundamentally chaotic.
Right, life is nasty, brutish, and short.
Exactly. So Hobbes believes society requires a leviathan, this massive, intimidating, sovereign authority capable of forcing compliance.
And honestly, modern international relations is still heavily dominated by the realist school, right? Which dictates that nations exist in this state of perpetual anarchic struggle, making military might and territory the only true currencies.
But Chavan dismantles all of these frameworks by pointing out one shared, fatal flaw. Machiavelli, Hobbes, and realism all define power through the exertion of force and the active control over the behavior of others. They all assume absolute scarcity. Okay. And the defining characteristic of force is that it requires relentless, exhausting maintenance.
That makes sense. Force is a rapidly depleting resource.
Exactly. If your influence relies on keeping a population or a workforce or a rival nation afraid of you, you are obligated to wake up every single day and manufacture that fear.
You have to constantly demonstrate your capacity for violence or economic ruin.
Right. And Chavan asserts that these force-based theories do not describe power at all. They describe emergency protocols.
Wait, emergency protocol?
Yeah, when a system relies on intimidation, it is broadcasting that its underlying alignment has already failed.
But wait, didn't those classical theories build the modern world? I mean, nations still use militaries. And I'm struggling to separate this from, like, Joseph Nye's concept of soft power.
That's a really good point to bring up.
Because soft power relies on cultural influence, diplomacy, economic persuasion, getting people to want what you want without military coercion. Isn't Chavan just applying physics metaphors to soft power?
It definitely seems similar on the surface, but Chavan makes a razor-sharp distinction between the two in the text.
Okay, what is it?
Soft power is still fundamentally an active exertion of energy. Persuasion requires constant messaging.
Like PR campaigns.
Exactly. It requires cultural campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, and the continuous offering of economic incentives. You are still actively expending resources to convince an entity to alter its natural behavior.
Ah, I see.
So Chavan argues that force and persuasion both suffer from the exact same structural weakness. They are events.
And events require fuel.
Exactly. When you stop funding the diplomatic mission or the cultural campaign loses its appeal, the influence just evaporates. Architecture, on the other hand, is a system.
Events fade, systems endure. That phrase from the text completely rewired how I view historical timelines.
It's so powerful. The physical universe ruthlessly seeks equilibrium, right? It rewards stability and minimal energy expenditure.
Systems naturally, inevitably evolve toward the path of minimal resistance.
Therefore, the ultimate expression of power is not forcing an adversary to bend to your will, nor is it persuading them through diplomatic charm.
Right.
It is designing the physical and psychological architecture of the environment so that bending to your will is the only mathematically stable option available to them.
So you design the slope of the mountain so the water naturally flows into your reservoir. You don't have to shout at the water.
Yeah.
You don't have to deploy diplomats to persuade the water. The geometry of the mountain does all the work.
That is the perfect analogy. And we can apply this to the historical case studies the text uses to differentiate between true alignment and the illusion of force.
Oh, yeah, the Soviet Union example.
Well, right. The early Soviet Union offers this brilliant, purely structural analysis. And the sources make it very clear that this analysis operates entirely independent of ideology or morality.
Right, we're remaining totally impartial here, just reporting what the text says. It's a strict evaluation of systemic coherence.
Exactly. So in its early developmental phase, the Soviet Union possessed genuine structural power.
Really?
Yes, the system achieved massive alignment. You had a mobilized population, a shared industrial purpose across vast and disparate institutions, and an architecture capable of absorbing staggering internal hardship without fragmenting.
Wow.
During this period, influence wasn't merely carried by the authority of the vanguard, it was distributed evenly through that shared direction.
So the state didn't have to constantly prove its dominance because the internal field was fully aligned toward rapid industrialization.
Correct. But then we see the fatal shift from alignment to enforcement.
Right around the consolidation of Stalin's authority, right?
Yes. The system confused alignment with ideology enforcement. The vanguard mistook the state's authority for true power.
Ah. So they started demanding compliance rather than allowing coherence to naturally produce results.
Right. In a healthy, aligned system, dissent is merely a feedback signal.
Like a dashboard light.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It indicates a minor misalignment that requires an architectural adjustment. But the Soviet leadership reclassified internal friction as a lethal threat.
They began violently correcting the field instead of reading it.
And that is the precise moment they substituted force for power. And while the state appeared monolithic and invincible from the outside for several more decades, the structural decay was already terminal.
They spent vast amounts of their systemic energy just policing their own internal friction. It's fascinating. The text also contrasts this with Pakistan, presenting a case study of a system entirely consumed by continuous motion.
Yeah, Pakistan is utilized in the UPA framework to demonstrate a system surviving through reaction rather than structural alignment.
Reaction.
Historically, the state has frequently confused authority, specifically military dominance, with power.
So the architecture is continuously reacting to internal fractures and external geopolitical pressures.
Exactly. Because the system is locked in a state of perpetual reaction, the field never achieves equilibrium. You see constant displays of force, right? Military posturing, martial law, aggressive foreign policy stances.
But true, enduring power never materializes because the underlying coherence is absent. The energy is entirely spent on merely staying afloat.
It is the geopolitical equivalent of treading water during a storm. The motion is frantic, the energy expenditure is massive, but the system is not actually advancing, it's just fighting gravity.
Okay, so if classical theories of force and persuasion are merely emergency protocols masking structural weakness, we need to examine Chavan's alternative.
Right, how does true power actually operate on a mechanical level?
Which brings us directly to the core of the unified power architecture, the 12 Chavanian Laws of Power. Chavan attempts to define the specific mechanics of what he calls consequence geometry.
Consequence geometry. Such a great term.
I want to spend some time on this, specifically the first block of laws which outline the fundamental physics of influence.
Okay, let's look at Law 1. It states, power emerges when intelligence shapes the path, not force.
So this establishes the prerequisite for all subsequent laws. Capability alone, whether that is vast wealth, a massive military arsenal, or even high computational capacity, is inert without alignment.
Exactly. If your internal resources and your external environment are clashing, your capability only generates noise and friction.
Alignment requires intelligence.
Yes. And intelligence in this framework is the ability to foresee how consequences will ripple through a complex system and to position yourself favorably ahead of those ripples.
Which perfectly introduces Law 2, minimum effort, maximum impact. Chavan roots this deeply in the physical sciences, specifically the least action principle.
And the mapping of thermodynamics onto human behavior is where Chavan's work becomes incredibly predictive.
The least action principle dictates that a dynamic system will naturally evolve along the path that minimizes its energy cost.
The universe is inherently lazy.
Right, doesn't waste effort.
And Chavan applies this to systemic influence. The most powerful actor in any network is the one expending the least energy to achieve their outcomes.
So if an entity is struggling, deploying vast resources, and relying on friction to force an outcome, that entity is structurally weak.
Yes, true power dictates that your field is so perfectly engineered that the smallest action, a subtle shift in policy, a single public statement, produces a disproportionately massive result because the architecture itself amplifies the action.
And the natural byproduct of that minimal effort is Law 4, silent emergence.
What's fascinating here is that this completely contradicts our cultural obsession with loud, charismatic leadership.
Totally. The law states that noise is the ultimate signature of weakness, whereas true power reshapes the environment silently.
And we observe this dynamic across every scale of human interaction. The loudest entity in a room is rarely the most influential.
Right. A leader who has to verbally remind their subordinates of their authority has already lost the structural alignment of the group.
Exactly. As an architecture matures and stabilizes, the need to announce its presence diminishes to zero. The field simply reveals itself by naturally warping the behavior of every participant within it.
And that warping effect is codified in Law 5, zero-time influence.
This is a big one.
Real power aligns other entities instantly before a negotiation is drafted, before resistance can even organize.
It is exactly like a gravitational field. The sun does not hold diplomatic summits with the Earth to persuade it to remain in orbit.
It doesn't threaten the Earth with solar flares if it attempts to leave.
No, the sheer, staggering mass of the sun warps the geometry of space to such a degree that orbiting is simply the path of least resistance.
The Earth complies in total silence.
The sun possesses absolute zero-time influence. The moment the mass exists, the alignment is instantaneous.
Okay, if we scale this massive celestial concept down to the psychology of a modern workplace, the mechanics remain perfectly identical. I can map this perfectly onto several corporate environments I have navigated.
Oh, for sure. Consider a manager who attempts to lead through relentless force.
Okay.
They send urgent, all-caps emails late at night. They micromanage minor tasks. They convene emergency meetings to demand better metrics.
Oh, we all know that manager.
Right. This individual is generating immense noise and relying entirely on friction. Under the UPA framework, they are operating from a position of profound structural weakness.
Because their internal architecture is fractured, so they have to deploy constant, exhausting force to temporarily bridge the gaps.
Exactly. They are essentially running the late-stage Soviet Union playbook in a mid-level marketing department.
That is hilarious, but so true. They are enforcing compliance because the alignment is shattered.
Now contrast that manager with a structurally powerful leader operating in the exact same environment. This second individual rarely raises their voice.
Their communication is sparse, but highly concentrated.
Yes, they have engineered a baseline of expectations, a structural architecture of performance, and the team naturally calibrates to that baseline.
This leader does not demand compliance. The environment they have constructed makes compliance the most logical, frictionless choice for the employees.
That is silent emergence and minimum effort, functioning perfectly in a corporate ecosystem.
Feeling a gravitational pull in a corporate office or, on a global stage is a fascinating theoretical goal. But the mechanics of actually constructing that gravity require deliberate design.
It does.
How does an entity ensure it becomes the sun rather than a fragile asteroid caught in someone else's orbit?
Well, the transition from theory to execution is detailed in the most ruthlessly pragmatic concepts within the text. That's Law 6, which covers risk externalization or risk routing.
And Law 7, which introduces inevitability architecture.
Right. Let's talk about risk routing.
The analysis of risk routing fundamentally changed my understanding of corporate strategy. Chavan observes that risk is not a random occurrence.
Is not bad luck.
No. It behaves like a fluid. It flows along a measurable gradient.
When volatility strikes a complex system, the damage does not distribute evenly. Chavan observes that influential actors deliberately construct their systems to position themselves strictly upstream.
Okay, upstream.
They design the architecture so that they retain the leverage and the operational control, but the volatility, the financial shocks, and the physical dangers are continuously routed to downstream buffer layers.
So the architect does not magically evade risk. They engineer the topography of the system so that risk is forced to flow around them.
Exactly. The sources provide incredibly clear examples of this flowing gradient in modern technology giants.
Right, let's look at the operational structure of Amazon. They manage a global marketplace with millions of obscure, highly volatile products.
And holding that much random inventory is a massive financial risk.
Right. So Amazon bypasses this by externalizing the inventory risk to third-party independent sellers. The downstream seller purchases the inventory, pays for the storage, and absorbs the financial shock if the product fails to sell.
And Amazon, sitting upstream, simply owns the infrastructure. They extract a transaction fee regardless of the individual product's success.
The core is protected, while the edges absorb the volatility.
Uber represents another flawless execution of risk routing. The company achieved global dominance in the transportation sector without owning a fleet of vehicles.
Right.
They systematically externalized the massive asset risk, the rapid depreciation of the cars, the volatile cost of fuel, the insurance liabilities, the maintenance to millions of individual downstream drivers.
So if a vehicle suffers a catastrophic mechanical failure, the driver absorbs the entirety of that financial shock.
Exactly. Uber's core software platform remains entirely insulated. The buffer layers absorb the friction, allowing the upstream node to scale without consequence.
It is a brilliantly designed mechanism, though honestly somewhat chilling when you realize how many of us function daily as the buffer layers for a larger entity's risk routing.
It really is.
And this downstream externalization is the foundation for Law 7, inevitability architecture.
Yes. Inevitability is the ultimate state of consequence geometry. It occurs when your specific operational direction becomes the environment's only viable direction.
So it's not a state of being physically impregnable to attack.
No, it is the systemic reality that your collapse would inflict exponentially more damage on the surrounding ecosystem than your continued dominance.
Okay, but wait. You were describing a monopoly, right?
Hmm?
Standard Oil in the early 20th century, or early Microsoft, cornering a market so completely that nobody else can compete. How is inevitability architecture not just a Silicon Valley rebrand of monopolistic practices?
That's a great question, but there's a key difference. Monopolies rely on artificial barriers and constant force.
Okay.
A monopoly traps its users by actively eliminating alternatives, often through aggressive legal walls, hostile buyouts, or predatory pricing. A monopoly is basically a hostage situation.
It requires relentless enforcement to maintain the perimeter.
Exactly. Inevitability architecture, however, is fundamentally different because it relies on the reduction of friction, not the erection of walls.
The reduction of friction.
Right. The system naturally desires to remain within your architecture because leaving it would introduce catastrophic instability to their own operations.
So a monopoly bolts the door so the user cannot escape. Inevitability designs the interior of the house to be so flawlessly integrated and the outside environment to be so comparatively chaotic that the user never even considers reaching for the doorknob.
That's exactly it. The broader system aggressively protects the inevitability architect out of sheer self-preservation.
You don't force alignment. You construct an environment where all alternative paths are computationally heavier, financially riskier, and structurally unstable.
Yep.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because the application of risk crowding and inevitability is actively rewriting the global geopolitical map right now as we transition out of the industrial era. Chavan argues that the metrics we have used for a century to measure national supremacy are entirely obsolete.
We have entered the compute century.
The compute century.
And this paradigm shift requires us to discard our reliance on GDP, population density, landmass, and traditional military arsenals as the primary indicators of power.
In the compute century, influence is purely a function of computational leverage.
Right. Semiconductors are not just a valuable commodity. They are not simply the new oil or the new steel.
Microchips sit fundamentally upstream of every single modern system on the planet.
Every single one. Financial markets, global logistics networks, healthcare infrastructure, advanced military targeting systems, they are all entirely downstream of compute.
So the entity that controls the architecture of compute controls the consequence geometry of the entire globe.
And the sources provide this masterful, impartial deconstruction of the current US-Taiwan-China semiconductor architecture to illustrate this.
The fascinating geopolitical triangle.
It perfectly manifests the laws of risk routing and hidden leverage. Consider Taiwan. Geographically, it is a small, highly vulnerable island with a relatively modest population.
Right. Under 20th century realist metrics, Taiwan cannot be a global superpower.
Yet, under the UPA framework, Taiwan represents the ultimate hidden leverage node, which is Law 8, by the way.
Because Taiwan houses the most advanced semiconductor fabrication facilities on Earth. They control the physical upstream bottleneck of global computation.
Exactly. If the foundries in Taiwan halt production, the global economy does not just slow down, it functionally disintegrates.
Taiwan has engineered a state of global inevitability. But to understand the flow of risk, we must map the entire triangle.
Right, so the United States controls the design and ecosystem architecture.
American firms dominate the intellectual property, design the chip architectures, control the foundational cloud ecosystems like AWS, and dictate the global standards for artificial intelligence integration.
So the U.S. retains the highest leverage upstream position the design, while deliberately routing the staggering capital expenditure, the operational volatility, and the geopolitical risk of physically manufacturing the chips to Taiwan.
Wow, so that's the risk routing. And the third node in this consequence geometry is China.
According to Chavan's analysis, China holds the downstream integration and manufacturing depth. They possess the vast industrial infrastructure required to assemble the final products that rely on these advanced chips.
The system is perfectly, inextricably interdependent.
Yes, the U.S. acts as the upstream architect, Taiwan serves as the critical physical leverage node, and China functions as the downstream integrator.
And this interdependence creates a phenomenon Chavan calls deterrence through consequence geometry.
Which is a brilliant evolution of how we think about war.
Right. During the Cold War, peace was maintained through mutually assured destruction. If one side launched nuclear missiles, the other retaliated, and both populations were annihilated. The compute century has replaced nuclear deterrence with architectural deterrence.
A traditional kinetic military conflict over Taiwan is structurally inhibited by the architecture itself.
How?
Well, if an aggressor were to launch a military strike and inadvertently destroy or disrupt the delicate upstream fabrication nodes in Taiwan, the global compute field would instantaneously collapse. Because the aggressor's own military logistics, domestic economy, and internal surveillance apparatus are fundamentally dependent on that exact compute field, initiating a war is computationally equivalent to bombing one's own infrastructure.
The deterrence is built into the math of this system. You don't need an impenetrable missile defense shield if your adversary's internal stability depends entirely on the continuous operation of the factory you are guarding.
It is mutually assured compute destruction. The architecture enforces its own survival.
This scale of geopolitical engineering is staggering, but Chavan insists that these laws are scale invariant. We see the exact same inevitability mechanics deployed by individual corporations.
We do.
The text points to Apple as the prime example of a company operating not as a consumer electronics brand, but as a sovereign digital nation.
Apple executes inevitability architecture with flawless precision. If you ask a consumer to identify Apple's product, they will invariably point to the physical hardware.
They will say the product is the iPhone, a slab of machined metal and glass.
Under the UPA framework, the hardware is merely the terminal. The actual product is the intangible architecture. iOS, the App Store ecosystem, iCloud synchronization, and the seamless communication protocols between the phone, the smartwatch, and the laptop.
Apple has engineered an ecosystem where entry is highly desirable. Remaining within the ecosystem is utterly frictionless. And attempting to leave introduces massive psychological and operational pain.
It really does.
If a user attempts to migrate to an Android device, they lose their iMessage continuity, their photo libraries become fragmented, and their purchase applications must be abandoned.
So Apple does not need to build a monopoly wall. They have engineered a friction slope so steep that leaving defies the least action principle.
And they also execute Law 6 flawlessly.
The risk routing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Apple outsources the lowest margin, highly volatile, capital-intensive physical manufacturing to massive supplier networks in Asia, like Foxconn.
If a supply chain disruption occurs or a factory faces labor unrest, the downstream supplier absorbs the financial shock.
Apple retains the high-leverage upstream nodes, the proprietary silicon design, the software architecture, the ecosystem rules, and the brand equity safely within its own borders.
They extract the maximum possible consequence from the global market while maintaining minimum risk exposure.
They dictate the environmental parameters that thousands of other businesses must adapt to in order to survive. That is the definition of structural power.
It really is.
However, the true brilliance of the UPA framework is its universal scale invariance.
Right. These architectural principles do not exclusively govern trillion-dollar technology ecosystems and nuclear superpowers.
The physics of influence scale all the way down to the internal psychology of a single human being.
Which transitions us perfectly into the final segment of our analysis, focusing on laws 9 through 12 and drawing heavily from the philosophy of power.
We have to examine the mechanics of human emotion, ego, and the stark, potentially catastrophic contrast with machine intelligence.
Let's start with Law 9, which establishes a fundamental psychological rule: stability dominance. Stable beats strong.
Stable beats strong.
Human culture deeply romanticizes strength. We idolize the forceful imposition of will. But Chavan argues that strength, devoid of structural stability, is simply a delayed form of self-destruction.
Wow.
Strong actors are locked in a perpetual war against time. They must continuously burn vast amounts of energy to force short-term outcomes.
While stable actors, conversely, ally with time. They design an aligned architecture and allow time to compound their leverage.
Exactly.
The application of this law to interpersonal relationships is incredibly revealing. I mean, every listener knows an individual who is defined by constant, volatile drama.
Oh, absolutely.
They react explosively to minor inconveniences, they are perpetually navigating some self-manufactured crisis, and they demand constant attention.
According to the mechanics of UPA, that highly dramatic individual is frantically burning their own systemic fuel. They are absorbing the entirety of the relationship's risk.
Meanwhile, the emotionally stable individual in that dynamic becomes the psychological center of gravity.
Yes. The stable person does not need to shout, argue, or actively attempt to control the volatile individual.
Their sheer predictability, their refusal to react, creates a dense psychological field.
Over time, the volatile person is mathematically forced to adjust their behavior to accommodate the stable person's baseline, simply because stability exerts a vastly superior gravitational pull compared to chaos.
Let's ground this in a daily scenario. You receive a hostile, aggressively worded multi-paragraph email from a colleague attempting to provoke a conflict.
We've all been there.
Right. Your instinct is to demonstrate strength. You want to type out a furious, point-by-point defense to prove you are right.
But the moment you hit send on that defensive reply, you have structurally lost.
You have willingly absorbed their volatility.
Yeah.
You've stepped out of your own alignment and entered their chaotic field.
You have expended your own energy to validate their noise.
Conversely, if you deploy Law 11, strategic non-interference, you alter the geometry of the exchange.
You reply with a single, emotionally flat sentence. I note your concerns. We will address them during the scheduled Friday review.
By refusing to match their energy, you have instantly routed the risk back to the aggressor. You have maintained your upstream position.
Your non-reaction fundamentally shapes the outcome of the conflict far more powerfully than any aggressive defense ever could.
What you refrain from shapes outcomes more than what you do. It sounds like Zen philosophy, but it is derived entirely from cold geometric logic.
The stable node simply absorbs the chaotic node.
And because of Law 12, universal scale invariance geometry is God, we understand that the exact same mathematical dynamic that allows an individual to diffuse a hostile email is the identical dynamic that allows a superpower to maintain a global reserve currency.
The geometry scales infinitely.
It's just mind-blowing.
The geometry scales, but the introduction of new variables can shatter it. The philosophy of power concludes with a highly specific structural warning regarding the integration of artificial intelligence.
And this is not a cinematic warning about sentient machines deciding to exterminate humanity, right?
No, not at all. The threat is purely structural, rooted in the mechanics of ambiguity.
Because human psychology is deeply uncomfortable with ambiguity. We dislike uncertainty and unresolved tension.
But crucially, the human mind possesses the capacity to hold that tension.
We can wait. We can observe a complex, evolving situation, pause our reactions, and allow the field to naturally settle into a new alignment.
The human capacity for strategic non-interference is a biological advantage. Machine intelligence, however, processes reality through a fundamentally different architecture.
Right.
An artificial intelligence system experiences ambiguity not as a temporary psychological discomfort, but as a critical error state.
An error state.
A machine is designed to optimize, predict, and resolve. Given a set of inputs, it is compelled by its core programming to generate an output. Resolution is not a strategic option for an AI, it is its existential purpose.
So a human leader can analyze a highly tense geopolitical standoff or a period of severe market volatility and recognize that the most powerful move is to do absolutely nothing.
The human can let the adversary exhaust their own resources fighting the ambiguity.
But an AI system looking at that same data will structurally demand an action.
And that forced action is the catalyst for systemic collapse. As Chavan established in his opening premise, power instantly decays the moment it reacts.
So if we seamlessly integrate AI into our most critical power architectures, granting algorithmic control over military response protocols, high-frequency financial markets, or foundational corporate strategy without embedding massive structural safeguards against forced resolution, we'll accelerate our own collapse.
The machine operates at speeds incomprehensible to human cognition, and because it cannot tolerate the unresolved tension of ambiguity, it will relentlessly force outcomes.
It will replace patient, silent alignment with instantaneous forced resolution.
And as Law 1 dictates, force is the antithesis of power.
An AI might perfectly calculate a strategic countermeasure, but by executing that countermeasure instantaneously, instead of allowing the system to naturally align, the AI shatters the consequence geometry.
It introduces an artificial reaction, and that reaction immediately ripples outward as systemic distortion. The logic is terrifyingly sound.
It really is.
It suggests that survival in the compute century will not be determined simply by which nation or corporation possesses the most advanced generative models.
The ultimate victor will be the entity that possesses the immense structural discipline required to restrain their AI.
To prevent the machine from reacting when silence is the mathematically superior strategy.
We have journeyed through an incredibly dense architectural framework today. We started by dismantling the classical illusions of Machiavelli and Hobbes, proving that force and fear are merely exhausting emergency protocols, not actual power.
We explored the physics of influence, where minimum effort and silent emergence warp the behavioral field like gravity.
We mapped the concepts of risk routing and inevitability architecture onto the global stage, analyzing how Taiwan's upstream semiconductor leverage and Apple's frictionless software ecosystem dictate the new rules of the compute century,
And we scaled those identical physical laws down to the human mind.
realizing that emotional stability exerts a stronger gravitational pull than aggressive chaos.
And that the inability to hold ambiguity, whether by an anxious human ego or a hyper-advanced AI algorithm, is the fastest vector for systemic collapse.
True influence is never about how violently you can push against a system. It is about meticulously designing the topography of the environment so that your desired outcome becomes the path of least resistance for everyone else.
You construct the field so that your success is the only mathematically stable consequence. I want to leave you with a final analytical lens derived from Law 10. Power belongs to the system designer, not the performer.
That's a profound thought.
Look at your career, your relationships, and your daily routines. Are you the architect of the systems you operate in, or are you just a highly efficient performer trapped in an inevitability architecture designed by someone else? And if you are the performer, what is the very first risk you need to route outward tomorrow morning to start reclaiming your field?
We began this deep dive by picturing the illusion of power, the noise, the force, the aggression. But Chavan proves that true power is entirely unequivocal. It is the silent gravity shaking the room long before anyone even realizes they are orbiting. Thank you for joining us as we deconstruct the hidden architectures governing our world. Carry that question with you into your environment tomorrow. Are you the architect or the performer? We will see you on the next one.